Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thank you, as always, thank you so much for listening. This week, an interesting question and answer episode. We began with, well, it was a Zoom call that you got from Monticello, Clay, and these were sort of overflow questions, so we did kind of an overtime episode.
Yeah, it's been such an honor. A year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago now, I gave a talk in Jefferson's lobby in the Indian Hall at the east entrance to Monticello for some of their special guests about the artifacts, the things that are on display in his cabinet of curiosities, mammoth bones, and those artifacts from the recreated artifacts from Lewis and Clark that Butch Thunderhawk and others did here in North Dakota for the bicentennial. And then the one authentic piece from Lewis and Clark in the entrance hall at Monticello is a set of elk horns. The rest of whatever Jefferson had from Lewis and Clark has unfortunately disappeared or gone into university collections. And so I did that. It was one of the great moments of my career. And then my friend Ann Lucas brought a group from Monticello on the Lewis and Clark trip last summer, not this summer. And then recently they asked me if I'd like to give a talk for their new online series. And I was, of course, honored and thrilled. And I chose the topic, Getting Noticed on the Lewis and Clark Trail, about how the journals actually operate. This is one of my my interests. I'm trying to write a book on the subject about how you get written up. So if you're like, let's say you're David Swenson, member of the expedition, and you're totally reliable, you never screw up, you never get hurt. You're just like an absolutely solid member of the expedition, but you don't ever, nothing happens that's so out of the ordinary that it has to get written up. You might only get mentioned in the musterings when they say, here are the group that left on this. And, the people that get noticed are the ones that something awful happens to, or something remarkable. They feed you when you're really hungry, or they find a way out of an impasse, or people that screw up and mouth off or get hurt or whatever. And so we have a distorted idea of what actually happened on the Lewis and Clark Trail because we're looking at the things that get mentioned, if I actually spent a week on the Lewis and Clark Trail, I might say this Swenson was outstanding. He's like your best guy. He's handsome. He sings. He's witty. He's the center.
Go on.
No, he's like, I'm really. I mean, you take my point that I could say this guy is fantastic. But he might never get written up because he's so normal, or nothing really weird happens to him. And so, archaeologists say that if you could spend one day in ancient Troy, we would know more about that whole world than we know from all of the archaeology that's ever been done.
It's a good point.
That's sort of the basis of this. And so that was the lecture. And, they were glad that so many questions were rolling in from around the country, and we didn't get to all of them. So I said, hi, what if on the next Jefferson Hour, we just pick up where we left off, and I'll try to answer as many of those questions as possible. So that's part one. Then Joe Ellis, our dear friend, has been getting a lot of mail. Now he's like shouldering you and me off the stage. And so we thought we better put some of these.
Which is fine with the both of us, right?
we better put some of these questions to Professor Ellis. And so he comes on in the middle section of this program to talk about questions that have come in either for both of us or for him.
It's really important to me to present those listener questions. We read every one of them, and we appreciate getting them. There was one thing that we touched on just briefly, and that was when Lewis and Clark encountered the Lakota on the riverbank in South Dakota.
Yeah, you say you have a new oral history of that.
Yeah, I came across a book. It's titled Crazy Horse, The Lakota Warrior's Life and Legacy, and really it's an oral history told by the Edward Clown family, who are the nearest living relatives to Crazy Horse, told to William B. Matson. And it's a great book, but there's one chapter devoted to Lewis and Clark's encounter with the Lakota. I'll read you just a paragraph from it. Clark treated Black Buffalo's action as an attempt to promote a personal showdown between the two. Clark prepared to do battle. Seeing that Clark was not thinking rationally, Black Buffalo diffused his anger by asking if our women and children could come see their vessel. This was one of the rare moments in these talks that Clark accurately deciphered what Black Buffalo was asking. And if you compare that with the diary entry of Patrick Gass, it really matches up quite accurately. And it's of great interest to me because years ago I did this project where I went out and recreated the sounds and the songs that Lewis and Clark would most probably have heard during their expedition. Went to the Missouri Riverbank with 4 young Lakota singers, Courtney and Dana Yellow Fat, John Eagle, and Eddie Patterson. And based on their knowledge and experience, we recreated the song that Patrick Gass writes about.
Well, I can't wait to see it because, we take oral tradition much more seriously today than ever before. And I think he got it right. But you know who else got it right is James Rhonda. I heard him give a lecture a number of years ago in which he said he just turned the tables on this story because it used to be told as if innocent Lewis and Clark come moving up the Missouri River and these icky, hostile native people try to turn them back and bully them. And he said, wait a minute. That's not an accurate way to look at this story. This was Lakota territory. They were sovereign. They had every right to be concerned about whoever these people were, that we need to look at this with fresh eyes. And he said it was Black Buffalo who solved the problem. Lewis and Clark got their backs up, and they were going to tough it out and maybe go to war. And Black Buffalo realized it's just not that big a deal. We're not gonna shed blood over this. Let's find a peaceful way to work our way through this moment of tension. And I didn't know from Rhonda, but from what you say, asking for the women and children to have a chance to kind of inspect the boats and see the tourists was another way of bringing more of a peaceful energy to what otherwise could have been a disastrous confrontation.
Right, yeah. Well, it's a fascinating account. I hope you get a chance to read it. But anyway, back to this week's show. It was great fun to be able to do all of these sort of overtime questions from your Zoom conference with Ann Lucas at Monticello. And we'll get to those right away. Before we go there, anything you want to update our listeners on this week?
I got to have my little Hamiltonian moment here. So a couple of things, very important. 9 states are now distributing Repairing Jefferson's America to every legislator in those states. People, if you're willing, it's not a hefty check to write, and we're donating the books, but if you are willing to help get a copy of Repairing Jefferson's America into the hands of every legislator in your state, contact us, and we have 9 states that are now doing it. I'm absolutely floored and thrilled by that. Secondly, my online course on Homer, on the Homeric epics, this is going to be spectacular, so go to the website for that. And then we have the 3 winter retreats at Lochsa Lodge, and we've opened up the Oppenheimer one, J. Robert Oppenheimer and the Making of the Atomic Bomb, to a second section because the demand was so high. And so there will be 3 retreats in January rather than the usual 2. But go to the site, jeffersonhour.com, for all of this. There's just so many things going on. We're planning another trip to France. So all of that coming on the Jefferson Hour site.
With that, shall we go to the show, sir?
Indeed we shall. And thanks again to Ann Lucas and the folks at Monticello. They could not have been more generous to me, and I'm thrilled to have this connection.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation about President Thomas Jefferson and American history. I'm your host, David Swenson, joined by the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, the award-winning humanities scholar and author, Clay Jenkinson. And good to hear your voice, Mr. Jenkinson.
Good to hear yours, David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, now in your 16th year as guest host.
Are you keeping track of that stuff?
Well, I know when I moved back to North Dakota, and I remember walking into Makoche Recording Studios and saying that I wanted to work with you on a series of projects, and that eventually led to some documentary films. And I then said, I moved from Reno. I haven't really figured out what's next. Would you be willing to serve as the guest host of the program for just a couple of weeks? And you said, a couple of weeks sounds good.
Yeah, I was pretty nervous, but that's a whole nother story. We could go down that rabbit hole for the entire show. But I do remember some great conversations with Mr. Jefferson. In fact, one of the questions we're going to answer this week is about a show we did back, 2009, called The Art of Conversation, and I so well remember that show. But there's a bunch of loose questions that I've compiled for this week, and what I'd like to do, sir, with your permission, is just present them to you. Now, the first batch of questions and the last batch of questions come from a Zoom conference that you did with Monticello. Do you want to explain to listeners what that was?
So I've had a relationship with Monticello for a long time, and Ann Lucas, my good friend there, contacted me earlier in the summer and said, would I be willing to do a Zoom lecture for their series? They've, like everyone else, moved into the virtual world because of the disruptions of coronavirus, and I, of course, immediately agreed. We settled upon the topic of Lewis and Clark, which is a particular interest to both of us, to Monticello and to me. And so I did that talk, and Ann Lucas was the moderator. She was terrific. She's a dear friend of mine. But we didn't get to all of the questions. The questions were rolling in from listeners and observers from around the country. And so I said at the end, what if I brought those to you, to David Swenson, and we went over them together on the Jefferson Hour, and then we will point people in Monticello's world to the program, and they can hear the follow-up from what turned out to be a very interesting question. And let me just say before we go to the questions that my topic was the journals. So we have 13 volumes of the journals of Lewis and Clark. There are 5 diarists, 6 depending on how you count, and so that's the basis. That's the documentary basis of what we know about the Lewis and Clark expedition, or much of what we know. And so I'm trying to look at those journals with a new eye to try to figure out when they were written and under what circumstances. Were they written in the evening around the fire as a kind of a dear diary? Were they written months later? To what extent were they revised or polished? And is Lewis's book, the book that was never written, is it somehow embedded in what we used to think of as his journals? Or to put it in another sense, what gets noticed on the Lewis and Clark Trail? Most things don't get noticed because they're busy and they're just moving on. So many of the members of the expedition almost never get mentioned. What does get noticed is when somebody gets hurt, when somebody expresses mutinous thoughts, when somebody hunts at a time when they're all hungry. We notice the things that inevitably rise above the radar of our consciousness, but many things in the expedition actually sat below that radar line. And so what I'm trying to do is to figure out more of the nuance and the way the dynamics of the journals actually worked. And I think that if we do that, we'll learn a great deal about the expedition that we previously didn't know. And all of this is possible thanks to Gary Moulton's excellent 13-volume edition of the journals of the expedition under the auspices of the University of Nebraska Press. So that was the conversation, and then these questions rolled in, and we didn't get to all of them.
For people who are interested in this and are Facebook page users, you can go to the Jefferson Hour Facebook page and find a link to watch this, titled Getting Noticed on the Lewis and Clark Trail with Ann Lucas, the senior historian at Monticello. There were a number of questions, interesting ones. I'll start with Kathleen, watching with her daughter at the time, who was reading a book on Lewis's dog, Seaman. Is there anything interesting you can tell us about Lewis's dog?
A lot. So that's the number one question asked by young people, whether I'm traveling in character or out. I perform as Lewis, and young people are particularly interested in this dog. It was a Newfoundland. Lewis bought it for $20, I believe. He was sort of following the lead of Alexander Mackenzie, a Canadian explorer who had a Newfoundland. And so Lewis was sort of checking the box on the things you take along with you. The dog turned out to be extremely important to the success of the expedition. It chased away buffalo. It hunted in the river for Lewis and Clark. And it became a kind of campsite companion. But here's the interesting thing. It disappears from the journals of Lewis and Clark on July 15th, 1806, by which I mean it never gets mentioned again. And so we don't know whether it died, whether it ran off, whether it survived and came back with Lewis, as many people believe, because, and this goes to my larger theme, David, Lewis and Clark never summed up. They never stopped at the end of the trip to say, let me tell you what happened to the dog, let me tell you what happened to all of the people, Let me describe Sacagawea. Let me give you a sense of an average day on the expedition. Let me give you a little personality profile of each of the expedition members. They didn't know we would be interested. They just disappeared. Most of the men retreated into a kind of historical obscurity. And so the dog ceases to be written up in the journal. We don't know what that signifies. It could signify any number of things. I presume that the dog didn't die, because if it died, you would have thought that it would have gotten written up for that reason alone. But this is a very busy, really intense time in the expedition, and so it just doesn't rise above the radar of what gets written up in the journals.
You would think if the dog had died or been injured or something, it would have been included, don't you think?
This is a time when the dog disappeared was during a crisis period in the expedition, when Lewis was exploring the Marias River, and they had splintered the group into 5 or 6 different subgroups. So we just don't know, but it's maddening because, of course, if I'm performing as Meriwether Lewis, a young person like this will say, well, tell me more about what happened to the dog. And then I have to say, I don't know, because you can't make it up, and we simply don't know. But I agree with you. If the dog had died, almost certainly one of the journal keepers would have said, and oh dear, the dog died yesterday.
Yeah,
but that
I would
never
think
happens.
so too. I would agree with that. Here's another question. It comes from Chris. Were American military medals exchanged for British or French medals with indigenous peoples at any point, the way Zebulon Pike did in his expedition of the Upper Missouri around that time?
That's a great question. So it's a complicated question. So let me start by saying there were medals. So it was common during this period for presidents to have medals struck with their image on them to commemorate their administration, and they were routinely given to Native peoples as both as gifts and commemoratives, but also as what I call sovereignty tokens. In other words, if I give a peace medal to the Lakota, the Sioux, I'm essentially involving them in a formal diplomatic relationship. By accepting the medal in a way, they're acknowledging the hegemony of the United States of America. So Jefferson had these medals struck with his image on one side, and on the other side, as you know, David, clasped hands, one native and one military, and then a hatchet and a peace pipe. And the legend on the medal is peace and friendship. And then Lewis and Clark also took some leftover medals from the Adams administration and the Washington administration, and they took a series that are really beautiful called the Four Seasons. They're seasonal agrarian depictions of the farming cycle in America at the time. And so they carried all these medals with them, and when they would meet a native group, they would then bestow medals of different sizes on the what they took to be the head chief and the sub-chiefs and so on. They frowned upon any tribe where they saw the sovereignty tokens of another nation. So if they saw a Spanish flag or a British flag or any of the other sovereignty tokens that those nations gave out, Lewis and Clark would say, they're no longer your father. We now are your father, and you ought not to be displaying such things anymore. But so far as I know, they never exchanged or confiscated these British or French or Spanish sovereignty tokens from another nation.
You brought up the peace medals in the Lakota, Clay. I recently read a book from the Edward Clown family, who are recognized as direct descendants of Crazy Horse, edited by William Matson. And it has an oral history of Lewis and Clark meeting the Lakota, which of course is very interesting to me because it's something I tried to recreate musically, but that's a fascinating story. And it's fascinating because it pretty much matches exactly what's in Patrick Gass's journal.
And previously, until the last 20 or so years, oral traditions were discounted as unreliable and imaginative or even fictitious. There's been a change, and now American historians are much more respectful of oral traditions than they used to be. So that's one thing. And secondly, what happened with the Lakota, with the Sioux, is just such a fascinating story. In a nutshell, I can say that Lewis and Clark had 2 really serious and intense confrontations with the Brule near Pierre, South Dakota. In both instances, they came close to bloodshed, and what the Lakota were basically saying is, this is our country. You're our guests. We'll decide whether we want you to go on and under what circumstances, but you can't just breeze through here because this is the nation of the Lakota. And Lewis and Clark, seeing it from a completely different point of view, thought, no way. We're not letting Indians tell us who's sovereign here. We bought the Louisiana Territory. And by the way, we have guns and we represent the most advanced industrial civilization in history. And so don't be telling us whether you can open or close the river. And twice this almost came to bloodshed. But the breakthrough, here's the most important part of it, the breakthrough that led to these tensions being eased came from the Lakota, not from Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark were really hardliners, and it was a Lakota leader by the name of Black Buffalo who said, look, it's not worth shedding blood over this. You've got to show some token that you get it, that we're the masters of this part of the Missouri. And Lewis and Clark reluctantly then offered a small tribute of tobacco as a way of saying, we get it, but we're not going to pay much, but we do want to get through this moment of tension. And so it's a really fascinating story, one of the 4 or 5 most important moments on the entire expedition. It occurred in South Dakota, and I can't wait to read a Native American oral account 200 years after the fact of how the Lakota saw this.
We need to take just a short break, Clay. Coming up, we're going to be joined by Professor Joseph Ellis, who's going to help answer some questions directed towards you and he, and then we'll return to more questions from your Monticello Zoom session. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. As I said before our break, we're going to be joined in this segment by Professor Joseph Ellis, who has agreed to answer some questions directed towards you, Clay, and he. The first question comes from Melanie Roberts. She writes that she has a 14-year-old son, an 8th grader, and he's doing online school this year. She said, I just couldn't take the risk of sending him in. She's trying to find additional resources for him about colonial America and the build-up to the American Revolution. And she's in the process of reading Founding Brothers. And while she's really enjoying it, she thinks it's over the head of her middle schooler and wonders if you have any recommendations for him to study this period of history. And Joseph Ellis, thanks for joining us. Can you answer this question?
Yeah, I think that it's been assigned in a lot of high schools, Founding Brothers, especially AP courses. She's probably right that her middle schooler is going to find this a little too tough, though that pains me to think that. But go to the internet and look up the Gilder Lehrman Institute, and you will then link to things. They have a collection of primary and secondary sources in American history that is second to none. Gilder, Gilder, Lehrman, Lehrman Institute. If you pursue that, you're going to have a cornucopia of primary and secondary sources from which you can select.
What about you, Clay? I know you responded to this woman right away and actually offered that her son could come on and question Thomas Jefferson.
Well, I think her son could come on the show. I urged her to have him make a list of questions, and we'll do a program with him. We could either do them by having her send in the questions, or he could actually appear on the program. That's something we've done before. The other thing I would suggest to Mary is that she read Founding Brothers and then take excerpts. So there are parts of it that a middle school student would have no problem with whatsoever. The length of the book and the overarching complexity may be more than he can handle, but she could certainly go in and find nuggets of description or analysis that she could then type out or photocopy, and they could go through those together, and she could then provide the sort of the continuity for the rest of the book. I think that would be great. Or if Joe's willing, if her son wants to come on, he could ask the master himself.
Yeah, I've got a website, josephellishistorian.com, and if he writes me, and if he gets certain selections that his mother gives him and then has questions about them, I will respond.
I have to say, I think both of you gentlemen are being incredibly generous with your time. I salute you for that. We have another question here from Robert Rosen, and he's asking about the letters exchanged between Jefferson and Adams later in life. And he wants to know about a specific letter that Jefferson wrote to Adams but never sent. He writes, following the election of 1796, Mr. Adams apparently hoped that he and Mr. Jefferson could work together as they once had done.
Oh, yeah.
So you know the letter, right?
Yeah.
Robert Rosen, Lakeland, Florida, he wants to know, why didn't Mr. Jefferson send the letter? Why did he decide he could not work with Mr. Adams again?
Because he gave the letter to James Madison, his closest friend and advisor, and Madison said, don't send it, because we're going to be going to war with the Federalist Party. We're going to be the opposition party. And by giving him this letter, you are saying that you're going to be part of his administration. Adams had offered Jefferson new powers as vice president. They wanted to have him help control foreign policy, and he believed that an Adams and Jefferson presidency was capable of surviving better than just an Adams presidency. So he wanted to do a kind of bipartisan presidency, and Madison told Jefferson that no, they were going to be partisans, that his friendship to Adams had to take second place to his role as head of the new Republican Party.
I think an important opportunity was lost here, but we need to remember that the system was not yet gelled. So when Adams becomes president, he does think of himself as the heir apparent, but Jefferson has won nearly as many electoral votes. They're old friends, and though they disagree on some things, I think Adams thought maybe there's, and I'm going to exaggerate, but I think you get the sense of it. I think Jefferson or Adams thought maybe we're kind of like partners or co-presidents here. And so he sort of reached out to Jefferson, and Jefferson's impulse, because Jefferson is a deeply generous man at heart, and he loved Adams, and his impulse was to say yes. But Madison said, absolutely not. You're going to straitjacket yourself and us. But if they had been able to do it, it might have changed the very way we see the presidency. But both of their partisans were appalled by this kind of flirtation, and Jefferson always let Madison veto his trial balloons. And in this case, Madison said, "You're just not sending that letter." Jefferson pocketed it, and the history of that administration worked out as it did. And Jefferson was not only a member of the opposition, but in many respects, he was a disloyal member of the opposition.
I have another one that I think I would really like both of you to respond to. It comes from Charles Snyder, and he writes, "Whenever we talk about the revolution, I always hear about the American spirit and the drive for liberty as if almost all of the colonists were in agreement. The counter-arguments are rarely brought up, and yet a large part of the populace were either against or at least apathetic to the cause, because for many, their lot in life would not really change. Did the revolutionaries just have a better PR campaign? What's your answer to that?"
Well, they didn't. The best estimate is almost 20% of the population were loyalists. Of that group, some of them were really extreme loyalists and joined the British side and even fought on the British side. There's loyalist units, but the real answer to the question is the First Continental Congress created what they called the Common Cause, that each town, each county, each hamlet would create a committee of safety and security. And they would go house to house. And in each house, you were asked to sign an oath to the principles of the revolution. If you didn't sign, they were going to put your name in the newspaper, and then merchants weren't going to sell to you. You couldn't go to church. And that if you then eventually didn't come around, they were going to come and burn your house down. And so at local level, these committees of safety were enforcing a process of politicization that required that you take a stand. You couldn't be indifferent.
I think of the Latin phrase quid ad nos, which means what is that to us? And I think in most human affairs, the mass of people are very lightly interested, if interested at all, in what's going on. They're leading their lives, and they have a somewhat detached view of these kind of things that we think are so urgent. And we find this every year, that especially during an election year, that the people who are deeply tied into the current events think that all of America is concerned about these things, but most people are on their vacations, and they're making car payments, and they're worrying about buying school supplies and so on. And so if you could actually sort of canvass the 4 million Americans at the time of the Revolution, I'd be very surprised if a majority were deeply connected to this movement. I think a lot of people were led profoundly local lives, and these are usually events that are driven by a cluster of aristocrats. And that was certainly the case in the American Revolution. You have Adams, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Patrick Henry. This is not average people. Average people are usually not the drivers of these things, although they're usually the cannon fodder once the battles begin. Do you think that's fair, Joe?
I think it is, but the distinctive feature about the American Revolution is they created local committees that precluded the possibility of opting out, and that the control of the countryside in the hands of these committees of safety, enforced by local militia, by the way, that they would come to your house and tell you that, either you sign on or you leave, and if you stay, we're going to threaten you with serious bodily harm, and we're going to burn your house down. And you've got to remember, if the loyalists, if by some miracle the British had won the war, the loyalists would have been standing at the gallows cheering as their neighbors were being carried up to be hanged, because that's what was going to happen to them.
Just one more thing about this, David. It's a cliche, but it's true. This dawned on Washington over time, but it wasn't his instinctive approach to it. But what he realized over time was, we win if we don't lose, and the British lose if they don't win. This happens in all wars of occupation. If you don't win, if the British don't win, they lose, and the Americans just have to not lose in order to win, because at some point the British are going to run out of money and willingness to carry on this battle, which is precisely what did happen.
Great question. I'm going to try to sneak one more into the two of you, if I might. And Joe, this one is a little before your time. It comes from a show that we did in 2009, Clay, and I remember this show well. I think it was called The Art of Conversation, and we talked to Jefferson about that. Joseph Schmidt wrote in about that conversation, and it really had an effect on him. He said, we talked about how in our time the art of conversation has largely been lost because we have fallen out of the discipline of having great conversations, and it really stuck with him. He and his wife started a book club, and for the past 10 years, they've been working on improving their skill in the art of conversation. He said it's led him to deeper and more meaningful friendships and relationships. So that's great. The question is, how would Jefferson judge a leader based on their reading habits? He says, we've all heard that phrase, leaders are readers. So how would Jefferson judge a leader based on his reading habits or lack thereof, or would he place any particular judgment on what is read?
Let me start on this one. A couple of things, and then I'll give it to Joe. First of all, not all leaders are readers. We've had great leaders who weren't readers. And so the thing to remember is that there's a wide variety of leadership perspectives and approaches, and there's no way to generalize completely about such things. So you have extremely well-read people like John Quincy Adams, who turn out to be pretty bad presidents, and you have people who are relatively lightly read, like Ronald Reagan, who turns out to be a consequential president and manages to really to appeal to a very wide range of the American people. So we need to be careful about generalizing about the role of reading in the formation of great leaders. An ideal person in this respect is Theodore Roosevelt, who was one of the readingest men in American history, but was also a man of action and never let his reading get in the way of his capacity to make decisions. And the other thing I would say before Joe speaks is that I'm glad for this letter. The art of conversation, I can tell you exactly what skill in conversation is. It's listening. That a conversation is made rich by the capacity of each person to listen to the other, and not just listen like waiting for them to stop so you can talk, but listening in a proactive, generous way and saying, I hear what you're saying, and although I disagree with it, I think this and this and this are important. That capacity to listen with creative energy and a generosity of spirit is so rare that it makes conversation almost impossible. And if you turn on MSNBC or Fox, for example, you don't see it because people have entirely forgotten that listening is the centerpiece of good conversation. So go, Joe.
I think that based on my experience as a teacher for 44 years at undergraduate colleges, most of them pretty selective places, that the internet has had a cognitive effect that people's attention spans are much shorter. People in the 18th and 19th century went to lectures that lasted for hours, or debates, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and they're used to sitting through and listening. The current and rising generation of Americans are cognitively indisposed to that. They can't read as much. You can't assign as much. They can't read a whole book. I would also say that we failed middle school and high school level to teach the main narrative of American history. And the way I would put it is this, that a majority of Americans could not pass the civics test that immigrants are required to pass to become citizens in the United States. And while I tend to agree with Clay's point about reading, there have been, John Quincy is the best read president in American history, and he did have a failed presidency. I think Ronald Reagan read more than you think he did. And he read,
I agree.
But there is a correlation in my mind between a person's understanding of American history and of history in general, and their capacity as a leader to understand the larger forces in play at the time of their presidency. I remember when, in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy's getting all this military advice from Curtis LeMay about bombing Cuba, and he said, I don't want anybody to write a book called The Guns of October. When he was thinking of the book Guns of August and the coming of World War I. And he also said, generals talk like generals. And that reflected both his reading and his experience in PT 109 in the Pacific. So that when presidents face crisis, they can't read up on it. They have to bring to bear a knowledge and a pre-existent knowledge. You can't learn anything new because you're so busy just keeping up as president. You have to bring a legacy of information to that's rooted in reading. And in that sense, I think that the leadership at the top is that one of the problems that we have now, both in the leaders and in the voters, is that that there is not an understanding of American history with any kind of rootedness anymore.
But how about this question of how would Jefferson judge a leader based on their reading habits? I know there's that famous story of a book being returned, I believe, by Patrick Henry, and Jefferson discovering that he hadn't even opened it.
The pages weren't cut.
And Jefferson said that Henry was the laziest reader that he ever knew, he said.
He thought Henry was a kind of facile, eloquent guy, but had no roots at all. I think that not just Jefferson, but all of the prominent founders. Washington was not a well-read man, and he was, as I said when Adams went to Harvard and Jefferson went to William and Mary, Washington went to war, and he learned from experience more than from books. I think, though, that generation would have. What's distinguishing about them is their classical education. Again, Washington's the odd man out in this, but that they were educated in the Latin and Greek classics, and that if you read the correspondence between Adams and Jefferson at the end, they're showing off. I've just reread Cicero on Catiline, and there's a presumption of a common set of sources that they all know. And if you don't know it, you're not in the club. You're not in the conversation. And there's nothing like that now in terms of knowledge has been divided into so many compartments and that then we're all divided into apps and into MSNBC versus Fox News, as Clay was suggesting, so that the kind of dialogue that you could have of listeners and speakers is much less likely and possible than it did in the 18th century.
I think that's what Joseph Schmidt was getting at, and I congratulate him on his book club and furthering the art of conversation. and also for reminding me of that show, which you should be able to find at jeffersonhour.com if you're a 1776 Club member and have access to all the archives. Maybe we can put a link up at the website if you're interested in hearing that. Meanwhile, Mr. Ellis, thank you so much for joining us this week to help answer some of these questions. We're going to take a short break. When we return, we'll return to more questions from the Monticello Zoom conference call. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. It's always so much fun to have Joseph Ellis participate, and to listen to the two of you answer all those questions was a real treat. But I want to go back to the questions that you missed on your Zoom broadcast with Ann Lucas.
Ann Lucas was the one who was featured on our show a number of years ago because she, representing Monticello, went out to Washington University in St. Louis, and she affirmed that those books that were found in their collection were in fact from Jefferson's library. You remember that this was big news when it occurred, and Washington University was intrigued by this and wondered whether these were Jefferson-related books. Monticello dispatched Ann Lucas out to take a look at them. She affirmed that they were. She's an extraordinary scholar. In addition to being a senior historian at Monticello, she's also the author of a book on Jefferson's favorite granddaughter, Ellen.
The people at Monticello have been so generous with their time when it comes to the Jefferson Hour, and it's home to our favorite gardener.
Pat Brodowski, of course, who is our dear friend at the Gardens of Monticello. And I've heard via the grapevine that Pat has been a little lonely out there because, of course, they haven't had the same visitor relationship this year with the pandemic. And so she's informs me that, when they're up and running, hardly a week goes by without somebody coming and saying, I listened to the Jefferson Hour. I've been told to come say hello. And then she shows them around and feeds them from the garden.
We need to check in with her. I do follow her. Following her on Instagram is well worth the effort. But let's go back to some of these questions. One from Cynthia. Jefferson gave quite specific instructions for never having been out west and set very high expectations. Wondering how much flexibility he gave the explorers outside of his instructions.
The instructions were issued on the 20th of June, 1803. They're a masterpiece of Enlightenment taxonomy. Jefferson wanted Lewis to get latitude and longitude. He wanted him to bring back rare and unusual plants, new animals that had not yet been cataloged by science, to describe the soil types and to sort of designate places that might wind up being trade forts or military installations, and also to assess the land for its capacity to support family agriculture. And he wanted him to take down Indian languages during his times of leisure, and so on. It was a huge list of things that Jefferson wanted Meriwether Lewis to ascertain if he could, and Lewis dutifully attempted to fulfill all of Jefferson's demands, and by the way, did a really extraordinary job in doing so. Unfortunately, Lewis died before he could write up all of the results, and so some of it was lost at the time of his death in 1809. Did Jefferson give Lewis flexibility? Of course. And in a key passage, Jefferson said, look, if you get into a situation where you're in deep tension with native peoples, if they try to turn you back, if it looks like there's going to be blood, withdraw. Don't try to force your way through. It's better that you would come back with data. If something happens that you feel you should turn back, do it, and we'll regroup and send out a different sort of expedition. And he also said, you might want to send people back from time to time, if you can spare them, with artifacts or at least written records and maps, because Jefferson was really concerned, David, that if something went wrong, that the data would be lost. And so he wanted them to proliferate the database. And Jefferson even said, if you can find any paper of the birch bark, he had experimented on his botanizing trip with Madison up in Vermont with birch bark paper, and he thought that was more imperishable. And so he says, if you can find a permanent sort of paper, write down your records on that, and then divide them up so that no single chest or no single piece of your luggage contains all of your records. That's what we really need to have here. So it was marvelous, but he granted Lewis a very large amount of flexibility and discretion about how he would actually fulfill this thing. And remember, it was Lewis who hired Clark. Lewis unilaterally decided that he needed a second in command, a kind of partner in discovery, as he put it, and he's the one who hired William Clark. So for Jefferson, it was the Lewis expedition. For us, it's the Lewis and Clark expedition, and really, if we were fair about it, we might even want to say the Clark and Lewis expedition.
Huh. Here's one from George. He writes, how could Lewis and Clark not know the value of their exploration? He writes, I can't imagine Jefferson didn't properly prep them or what they themselves knew about the uncharted territory.
Well, they did know the importance of it, and you can hear it in Lewis's voice, on April 7th, 1805, when they're leaving Fort Mandan to enter the true discovery phase of the expedition. Lewis says, we were now about to penetrate a country at least 2,000 miles in width upon which the foot of civilized man has never trodden. And then when he reaches the source of the Missouri on August 12th, he says, thus far I'd accomplished one of those grand objects upon which my mind has been unalterably fixed for many years. So believe me, they understood the historical importance of what they were doing. They knew they were opening this country, that they were the first eyes to see it, that their journal entries would be the first descriptions of things like the Great Falls or the source of the Missouri or the pass, Lemhi Pass. They were very well aware of their historical destiny, but they broke down afterwards. So Clark kind of moved into his life. He did provide his superb map for Lewis, and Lewis was to sit down and write out this 3-volume account, which would solidify their place in history, which would make them rivals in some sense of Captain James Cook, or in our case, Zebulon Pike. But Lewis could never do it. He could never produce the books. And because of that, the expedition sort of fell into oblivion. And I've just been editing We Proceeded On. I'm the editor of that quarterly journal, as you know, and there's an article coming in the November issue about the election of 1820. So Lewis is long since dead. Clark has been the territorial appointed governor of Louisiana Territory. In 1820, he runs as the first governor of the new state of Missouri, and he loses. And it was shocking that this great man, the co-commander of this most important exploration in American history, would lose this gubernatorial political contest. And the author who wrote this, a friend of mine named William Foley, says, the expedition had sort of been forgotten. It was old news. It was long past. It had not created the splash, the dramatic notoriety that you might have expected. And so when we look at it, we think of this as this central adventure in American history. But it wasn't until the 20th century that it really gained that status. From 1814 until 1905, and really 1955. The expedition was just kind of a minor episode in American history, and more recently, it's just grown and grown and grown until it's this fundamentally important thing that everyone knows something about. And the Lewis and Clark Trail now extends from Pittsburgh all the way to Astoria on the Pacific coast and back again.
Here's another one from George. He writes, can you speak to Lewis's summary of the expedition members to Congress, where he essentially qualified individual efforts?
Yeah, we did talk about that on the Zoom conversation a little bit. So at the end, Lewis wrote a document to the War Department, and this was about how to pay off all the men. So Jefferson arranged for a generous compensation package where the men would receive double pay. And think about that, David, double pay for money they couldn't spend. So, I mean, it's not as if you're getting double pay in your routine life in, say, in Louisville or in Pittsburgh. This is double pay that's been accruing while you've been out on a wilderness expedition where money doesn't have any meaning. And so they were suddenly pretty well off just from the double pay. They also got land grants, and Lewis and Clark got much larger compensations by a grateful Congress, thanks to Jefferson's lead. And so Lewis had to write up his final report so that the War Department would know how to pay people off and so on. And he made a little assessment of some of, not all of the men. And in a few cases, as in, say, the case of Baptiste Lepage or Charbonneau, he grumbled about them and said they were not particularly useful. They have no peculiar merit. And then in other cases, like John Shields or George Drouillard, or the Field brothers, he goes out of his way to praise those individuals and say that they were superb, that they stepped up every time he needed them, that they had skill sets that he could not necessarily have anticipated, and that the success of the expedition owed a great deal to them. And so we get this lovely document. It's the only window we really have on how Lewis saw everybody post-expedition. Today, of course, we would sit down with him and there would be endless debriefings and videos, and we would have his assessment of every single person, from Silas Goodrich or Thomas Howard to William Werner, people that are obscure in our understanding. But if we had Lewis and we said, tell me about him, describe him, what was his accent? Did he have any religious affiliations? Was he a shirker? Did he rise to the occasion? Was he a good guy or a bad guy? Which clique or faction did he travel with? Was he a smart aleck? Did he sing? Could he swim? Did he chew tobacco? These are questions we simply don't know. And of course, we're hungry. We are desperately hungry for these facts. But Lewis and Clark, as I said before, didn't know we'd be interested, and so they never bothered to describe everyone. Today, every one of the members would have a reality show and a book contract, and it would turn out that each person was the key individual who saved the expedition.
Anne writes, what is the most important takeaway you would note that could be applied to today?
A couple of things. First of all, they had the right stuff. I wouldn't survive 3 days on the Lewis and Clark Trail. We're talking about men with a capacity for hard labor, a very high threshold of pain. We're really talking about Navy SEALs or Marines here. These were volunteers, most of them, who were inducted into the Army, but they had the right stuff, and they propelled that expedition, some 30 tons of stuff, really with their thighs and their backs and their shoulders. And they endured privations and physical suffering that I don't think that we can really understand. But think of sort of a 2-year Everest expedition, and you sort of get the sense of it. Or Lone Survivor, that film about a raid that went wrong in Afghanistan. So that's one thing. Secondly, you have to look at their goodwill. Now, we know now that they were harbingers of an imperial occupation of the American West, and that this was the beginning of the dispossession of native peoples and so on. And there's a certain amount of huff and puff in the way Lewis and Clark talked to native peoples. But on the whole, there was an innocence about their expedition that I think we need to remember. They were high-minded people, representatives of a very high-minded president, Thomas Jefferson. They were trying to do the right thing. They took down an enormous amount of Native American ethnography, including vocabularies. They showed goodwill, for the most part, everywhere they went. There was a sort of a Star Trek feeling of do them no harm, try to spare your hosts any significant dislocations, and when things occasionally did go wrong, Lewis and Clark agonized over it. They stole a canoe on the return journey because they needed it, but Lewis said, we felt uneasy about it. We felt guilty about it. And whenever they do wrong, at least in their own measure of doing wrong to native peoples, they note it, and they show signs of discomfort with violating their own moral code. So I think we're in such an age of disillusionment, as you know, about all these things. I think it's important to realize how much goodwill really existed in the hearts of Lewis and Clark.
We got an email at the Jefferson Hour website from Mark Anderson wondering if you're familiar with the historian Ryan Hall, who is a faculty member at Northern Arizona University. He wrote a book just recently called Beneath the Backbone of the World, Blackfoot People and the North American Borderlands. And in it, he offers new perspectives and analysis of the Lewis Blackfoot encounter. Are you familiar with this book?
No, I'd like to read it. I'm fascinated by this. Lewis got himself into a little armed struggle with 8 young Blackfeet men. They're probably teenagers, kind of on a lark. He wound up killing 2, at least 1, and probably 2. It was a mistake. Lewis traveled with just 3 of his men. He was undermanned, and they bivouacked with these 8 young Blackfeet men, and there was a skirmish at dawn in which the Blackfeet apparently tried to steal the firearms of the 4 members of the expedition and their horses, and in the melee that followed, 2 Blackfeet were killed. It's not one of the best moments of the expedition. It's really a mistake on Lewis's part. I know Jack Gladstone, who has affiliations with the Blackfeet, and is a singer-songwriter, storyteller, has always said that Lewis really overreacted in this situation, and that these were really just young men kind of doing Grand Theft Auto, horse raiding kind of thing, and that Lewis had intensified the tension between the young men and his own men by really mishandling the diplomacy on that fatal night of July 26, 27, 1806. So I would be very much interested in reading this and learning everything we can about how the Blackfeet have seen this, that it continues to play to have a role in their own oral tradition about the first encounters with white people on the Northern Plains.
Last question from Chip. Will there still be a movie made of the expedition?
Oh, that's a sad question. You know, I worked on the HBO miniseries with my friend John Curran, the director. I was up in Alberta for the filming. They built the Fort Mandan. They built Earth Lodge villages. They brought in authentic Native people from the actual tribes to be part of it. Millions were spent on sets and costumes. This was going to be a 5 or 6 or 7 part HBO miniseries. It was going to rival the John Adams miniseries for authenticity and integrity. And then for reasons that are still not quite clear, HBO pulled the plug on the project and it just collapsed. And I hear from my friends in that world every dozen months or so that they're going to revive the project, that there's renewed interest. But my guess is that it's just not now going to happen. You know, the project was begun by Ed Norton Jr. He aged out to play Meriwether Lewis. Brad Pitt was going to be Clark. Then they became executive producers. HBO spent millions on this project, and it just never got finished. And I was so fortunate to be asked to be the major historian for the project, and I had long, interesting conversations, in fact, retreats with the director, John Curran, and we worked over the script again and again and again to make sure that it was scrupulously accurate and a representative treatment of what actually happened out there. And so I grieve over this, but I know from other projects these things just happen. My hope is that somebody else will pick up this, because there's never been an adequate filmic treatment of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and we need it. It is such an important expedition, not just for the sheer adventure quality of it, David, but for all the flashpoints, the fissures, the places of later cultural and imperial tension that come up in this story. That this could really speak to our current debate about race and racial justice in the United States, and sort of the imperial cost of the conquest of the American West. So, alas, I don't think the project's coming back. I certainly wish it would.
So we'll leave that as to be determined. And with that, sir, it is time to say goodbye for this week.
Thanks to Ann Lucas and Monticello and all the people who tuned in for that extraordinary conversation that I was able to have with Monticello on the 9th of September. We'll see everyone next week for another important edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.